On February 24, 2022, Russia launched what it called a special military operation. The plan was arrogant. Kiev would fall in 3 days, Ukraine would collapse, and Moscow would celebrate a swift victory. Soldiers even carried parade uniforms, expecting to march through the capital. 3 years later, reality is the opposite. Russia holds only about 20% of Ukraine's land, most of it in the east and south. And the cost? Nearly 1 million casualties dead and wounded. Even conservative Western estimates say at least 750,000 Russians have been lost. That's more than all US losses in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined compressed into just 3 years. Territory gains are even more humiliating. In 2022, Russia captured just 4,000 to 100 square kilometers, about the size of Rhode Island. That's 0.6% of Ukraine's territory. Analysts at Forbes calculated that, if Russia continues at this pace, it would take over 200 years to conquer Ukraine. Even worse, the cost in human lives would approach 100 million soldiers, nearly Russia's entire population. This isn't strategy. It's national suicide. But history already warned us. In 1812, Napoleon marched into Russia with 500,000 men. He expected a quick victory, a triumphant march into Moscow. Instead, he lost nearly his entire army to resistance, hunger, and winter. In 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, planning to crush the Soviet Union in weeks. Instead, his armies were ground down in a war of attrition that destroyed Nazi Germany. And in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. 10 years later, it limped home, losing 15,000 men and shattering its global prestige. Today, Putin repeats these same mistakes. Overconfidence, underestimating the enemy, ignoring the limits of logistics, refusing to admit failure until it's too late. The demographic disaster is already here. Russia's fertility rate was collapsing long before the war. Now, hundreds of thousands of young men have fled abroad to avoid conscription, almost 1 million by 2025. That means fewer workers, fewer taxpayers, fewer fathers for the next generation. Whole villages are emptying of men. Compare this with the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where Moscow lost 15,000 soldiers in 10 years. In Ukraine, Russia loses that number in a few weeks. Inside Russia, the cracks are spreading. Mothers of mobilized soldiers protest outside military offices, demanding their sons come home. Videos surface of conscripts complaining they were sent to the front without training, without equipment, sometimes even without rifles. Corruption is so rampant that body armor is purchased by families themselves. Soldiers joke bitterly that the Russian army fights with AliExpress helmets. And what about the second most powerful army in the world? The myth has been shattered. Russian paratroopers failed to secure Kiev. Convoy stalled because trucks ran out of fuel. Soldiers carried expired rations. Tanks supposedly equipped with advanced armor were stuffed with sand and wood. By late 2023, Russia was sending 1960s-era T-60 tanks and even World War-era weapons to the front. A supposed 21st century superpower was fighting with museum pieces. Sanctions hit just as hard as battlefield losses. The ruble collapsed, losing 23% of its value in 2024. Russia's car industry shut down. Civil aviation cannibalizes Western jets for spare parts. Nearly 40% of the federal budget now goes directly to war spending. That means less for pensions, healthcare, and schools. Ordinary Russians pay the price while oligarchs and Kremlin insiders get richer. Energy exports, once Moscow's golden weapon, are crumbling. Before 2022, 40% of Europe's gas came from Russia. Today, it's less than half. Moscow sells oil to China and India at heavy discounts, sometimes $30 per barrel cheaper than global markets. Russia still pumps oil, but it earns far less. The energy superpower has been reduced to a bargain basement supplier. Geopolitically, Putin achieved the opposite of what he wanted. Instead of dividing the West, he united it. NATO is larger and stronger than at any time since the Cold War. Finland and Sweden have joined, doubling NATO's border with Russia. Poland is building Europe's largest standing army. Germany has massively increased its defense spending. And Ukraine? It's now closer to NATO than ever, armed with Western tanks, air defenses, and soon modern fighter jets. Meanwhile, Russia has become isolated. Its athletes banned from international competitions. Major Western corporations Apple, McDonald's, IKEA gone. banking system cut off from SWIFT, even cultural ties, movies, art, tourism broken. Once a great power, Russia is now a pariah. And this isolation has consequences inside Russia. Propaganda tells citizens the war is about defending against NATO. For older generations raised in the Soviet Union, this resonates. But younger Russians see through it. Many refuse mobilization, flee abroad, or resist silently. Families are torn apart. Social problems grow: unemployment, alcoholism, crime. The Kremlin hides the true cost, but ordinary people feel it every day. On the battlefield, the picture is no better. Russia has turned to convicts, mercenaries, and poorly trained conscripts to fill its ranks. Drone warfare and Ukrainian precision strikes destroy Russian columns before they can advance. Morale is collapsing. Our EPORTS shows soldiers refusing orders, sabotaging equipment, even surrendering to avoid suicide missions. And yet, Putin cannot stop. Withdrawal would mean political death. His entire regime is built on the illusion of strength. Admitting defeat would expose weakness and could trigger collapse at the very top of Russian power. So the war drags on, bleeding resources, lives, and legitimacy. So what comes next? 3 scenarios stand out. First, escalation. Moscow could threaten nuclear weapons, intensify mobilization, or attack supply lines in NATO countries. But each move risks catastrophic retaliation and even deeper isolation. Second, withdrawal. If the Kremlin cuts its losses and retreats, Putin's aura of invincibility shatters. He could face elite rebellion, mass protests, even the collapse of his rule. Third, endless stalemate. A frozen conflict, with Russia holding fragments of Ukraine while bleeding slowly. This is the most likely outcome: a war that never ends, draining Russia's resources year after year. But here is the irony. In every scenario, Russia loses. Escalation brings destruction. Withdrawal brings humiliation. Stalemate brings decay. And while Russia bleeds, Ukraine is not alone. Its resilience has inspired global support. Its people fight not just for survival, but for independence and democracy. Every day, they prove that a smaller nation can resist a so-called superpower if it has the will and the world behind it. So after 3 years, what has Russia really gained? 20% of territory it can't fully control. A shattered army. A collapsing economy. International isolation. A NATO alliance stronger than ever. And a future clouded by demographic decline and political uncertainty. The truth is undeniable. Russia isn't winning. It's stuck in a strategic disaster of its own making, with no clear exit. The longer this war continues, the worse the consequences will be, not just for Putin, but for Russia itself.